using, documenting them, and investing in them. I think that for me is what I would want to say at the onset. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. That's exactly what the type of messages from the ground that we needed to hear. And in fact, I think Dr. Ayman Cherakui, who we are also very honored to have here because he's the executive director of the UN Global Compact in Morocco, but also into the board and director of many other things. I won't explain the whole CV, but he was also involved very closely in the negotiations of a number of COPs. So he can actually look at the issue of food system from someone who has seen how climate negotiations work. And following directly from what Steve was saying, my first question to you, Ayman, is it true that public and private financial actors, public and private banks, tend to see adaptation really just as a cost? As Steve was saying, no? When you look at it as something small where, yeah, it's not necessarily easy to get money out of adaptation if you are a financier, but in reality, when you look at the longer term perspective, when you look at the aggregation of individual cases, as Steve said, that's very much of an investment. So how have you seen this sort of evolving over time, particularly in Africa? Thanks a lot, Ayman, to be here.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to speak next to my brother Stephen. Very happy to see friends as well in the room. Much appreciated. I'm currently the director of the Hassan II International Center for Environmental Training. And previously I had the privilege of serving as special advisor to the Moroccan COP22 presidency. In order to address your question, first, I happen to be not at the personal level, not the biggest fan of the word bankable project. I'm more of a fan of investable project rather than bankable project. I think there is a differentiation there that I can speak to a bit later. Looking at it from the African perspective, I wanted to bring to this conversation two elements. Well, actually three. I'm giving you a bonus one for free. So the first of them is the fact that from a food system perspective, in the context of the 2021 UN Food System Summit, the Kingdom of Morocco, represented by Ambassador Hillel, was active in the advisory committee to the Food System Summit. In that context, a meeting was organized with more than 40 African ministers of agriculture looking at this particular issue. And as such, I wanted to echo some of the key points they identified as being of particular import. First, that it was important to raise agricultural productivity to create income and wealth and stimulate economic growth. Second, that it was important to broaden growth to tackle exclusion and chronic vulnerability. Third, that there was an urgent need to foster resilience to a changing climate. And it's a good thing we're having this particular conversation here in the middle of COP27, the first African COP since COP22. Also, fourth, that it was important to boost competitiveness of the processing sector to capture urban markets. Fifth, expanding intra-African trade to boost income for African farmers. Sixth, that we needed to advance science and technology innovation and adoption. And seventh, the last message they shared was that we needed to develop more energy solutions for sustainable food systems transformation. Now, in order to address more specifically your question, I wanted to bring two things to the table. First, the importance to look, as you were saying, at it from a broader term, longer term perspective, and really to consider what makes it ticks, looking at it from an investable project, as a project that one would want to invest in. And in that regard, back in 2016, we had launched work on adaptation metrics, because when you can count something, then it makes it easier to convince investor to put the funds there. So we identified that as a priority, and we kept working on that. We also launched the initiative Adaptation of African Agriculture, where we've worked with many countries in Africa to develop investable, bankable projects that are country-owned. There's also an important element to have in mind, that this country ownership of this project, country definition of this project is very important. And once we've established that, then we look for funding in a manner that is rigorous and in a manner that is, again, country owned. And lastly, I was a bit late to join this meeting because I was in a high-level meeting at the the Congo Basin Climate Commission Pavilion just right next door. And this type of initiatives that are looking at regional cooperation within Africa, For example, in the context of COP22, 3 initiatives were launched that were regional. There was the launch of this Congo Basin Climate Commission that is chaired by the Republic of Congo. The launch also, and they have identified more than 200 projects, many of which are looking at agriculture and adaptation. We also have the Sahel Region Commission that is chaired by the Republic of Niger. And we have thirdly the Islands Commission that is chaired by the Republic of Seychelles. And the third bonus point I wanted to make to you is looking at it from a different angle, from the ground, as connecting also to what you were saying. I happen to have the privilege of having been re-elected just a couple of months ago as the regional facilitator for African major groups and stakeholders in the United Nations Environment Program space. And I've been working with them for 2 years already. I have the privilege of serving again for another 2 years. And the reality of the difficulty of finding funding from the grassroots level in a manner that is sustained, in a manner that is predictable. And it is very important that we have this predictability. Otherwise, we end up building capacity and then losing those stakeholders because they move to where the funding is available. They have to survive. They have to make the project live. So this kind of longer-term perspective in knowing what kind of sources of funding can be accessible is very important. I hope I wasn't too long. Thank you very much.
No, you are all fantastic speakers because you make important points, but very succinctly. So it is now my pleasure an honor to give the floor to Catherine Collin. She's one of the heads of divisions and directors of EIB Global, the European Investment Bank. So in fact, in the end, it's all about investment. And maybe Catherine, you can start explaining to us what blended finance really is, and using a concrete example from EIB Climate Adaptation Plan, because there's a huge expectation and some new announcement made here at COP27 on what you can do, and in particular, how can blended finance better reach smallholders? Please, Catherine, you have the floor, and thanks for being with us.
Hello. Yes, well, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks a lot, Francesco, for inviting me to participate in this panel with this with the colleagues around. And I'm very happy to have with us an East African representative, since I was based in Kenya for 6 years, and actually I've seen it for myself, actually. So and I will hopefully try and bring some concrete examples, because I think we hear a lot of talking about big initiatives and all that, but it's important as well to see how they translate into concrete actions on the ground. So I think I mean, you asked me to talk about blended finance. What is blended finance? And I'm sure everybody has Googled once in their lifetime to see what is blended finance, because we talk a lot about it. For me, it's not a new concept. We've been doing blended finance for years at EIB and in other institutions. It's probably now that we have put a label on it, so that it's a bit more systematic in what we do, but it's all about ensuring that you have a mix of resources that unlock investments. And there are roles to play for all stakeholders. Stakeholders like EIB, DFIs, financial development finance institution are there to bring in the so-called concessional element that will unlock private investments and private financing, hopefully, that will then unlock the scale of investments that we do need to achieve SDG, and that includes in terms of food security. So the role of institution like EIB, and EIB is an MDB, is a DFI, we are tackling this concessional element. We can't do that alone. And I think, you know, as much as Stephen was talking about partnership on the grounds, the partnerships needs to happen as well at the highest level. And that's also part of what we are hearing here. And it's equally important. I mean, both complement each other. So the concessional element, and it's part of our adaptation plan, which is a key component of the EIB Climate Bank roadmap, because the EIB was actually one of the first to make very ambitious commitment in terms of climate. We are the climate bank, and we want to deliver, and it's really streamlined in everything we do in the bank. So adaptation is a very important element of our climate bank roadmap, and we are committed to increase, actually by 3 times, our adaptation lending in what we do until 2025. And for that, we will do a couple of things. One thing is that, first of all, a very technical thing. Usually EIB can only provide 50% of the cost of a project, of any given project. When it comes to adaptation, we've increased that threshold to 75%. Why is that so? And even 100% when we talk about least developed countries and small islands development states. Why is that so? Because in those smaller economies, very often, it's more complicated to the partner to have 3 or 4 DFIs in front of them, and it's easier, because of the scale of the economy, to come alone and provide the full financing. It makes things quicker. So I think that's one element. Now, concessional finance means we need grants. And that's always the tricky part, because we are a bank, we provide loans, but we can help mobilize grants. And we work very closely, notably, of course, with the European Commission, because we are an EU institution, in mobilizing those grants, but also from other donors, our member states, the 27 member states of the European Union, to mobilize those grants. And those grants, we will use them in various ways. We can provide, of course, technical assistance. And a lot has to be done in the adaptation in terms of upstream engagement, helping the countries to develop their policies, to develop strategies, investment policy, to help tackle all these issues of floods, droughts that are impacting on food securities. And then we can also go a bit further in using these grants in terms of de-risking the investments, of course. And that is key to get on board the private investors, because that's our role, to help with the risk taking. And so this is how we are coming in, trying to help and having projects. And then I think one element that is extremely important when we talk about food security, we must do that in an environmental friendly manner, because we also know that agriculture is also responsible for a very important portion of emissions. So this is an element that we need to factor in our process as well when we look at these projects. So now, giving a very concrete example, I'll give you one from Kenya, because that's the one I know better, so I may as well do that one. But I think it's also a very good example, and I think from these examples, what is important is that there are pilots, and then once you see that it is successful in one country, you can usually replicate with a couple of adjustments in another country. What we've done in Kenya was a very interesting thing. We work, because another element of food security, smallholders, is that we are a large institution. We cannot finance them directly for a number of reasons. So we partner with local banks, commercial banks, and we try and partner with those that have a network across the country. For instance, in our case, we partnered with Equity Bank, which has a very large network of branches across the country. And that's how you achieve reach out throughout the country, rather than in a. And then what we did, we mobilized some grant from the EU, and we worked very closely with the EU, whereby part of that grant was actually set up for a challenge fund that was there to provide assistance and help to smallholders and small companies to build up their business plan, so that their projects, I will still use the term bankable, but nevertheless, their projects is bankable. And then we also used part of the grant, because our funding was in euro. Doesn't make sense when the revenue are in Kenya shilling, most of them. So our funding the grant was partly used to cover the foreign exchange risk cover for the banks, so that that they wouldn't replicate that cost to the beneficiary of the loan. And so by that, we have actually reached out to a very large number of small companies. And actually, these small companies along the value chain, one of the conditions for them to access the funding was that they had to include smallholders in the process, because we didn't want them to leave out the smallholders. And so that's a very concrete example. I think it's been quite successful. It's still running. And I mean, I think these are examples that we can replicate elsewhere. and move on that basis. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Catherine. That was very useful, a concrete example. In fact, now, again, honored and pleasure to have Suzanne van Tilburg here, and she's the global head for food and energy networks of Rabobank, one of the most important commercial banks worldwide investing in agriculture. And exactly because she knows a bit both worlds, and here this meeting is also about bridging the understanding between the food policymakers and expert and the climate policymaker and expert. Suzanne, from a private finance perspective, do you see there is a difference in the way public and private finance are understood in the food circles and the climate circle? Where do they come together? What is the common interest of the people working on food and climate from a finance perspective? Please, Suzanne, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Federico, for inviting me. And well, it's lovely to be here. It's a bit loud, but if you don't hear me well, I can speak even harder. I think, first of all, it's good to mention that Rabobank is positioning itself right now as a transition bank, which is not easy. So we are about to launch our Road to Paris report very soon, probably next week, in which we, as one of the few banks all around the globe, will for the first time ever disclose our financed emissions. And it's scary as hell, I can assure you, because the largest clients of the bank are in the food and agri space. And we will be the very, very first bank to also include scope 3, so also disclose the financed emissions by the food and ag space. I can assure you these are not easy conversations with our clients from Brazil to Australia to Europe. Now, what is important in doing this is how we can tell them how to define what they should do in order to do better. So we are not looking at financial health anymore for our clients only, on which we base the credits and the risks. But now we are looking at the sustainability performance risk. And that is a major shift in the way of thinking. What we need to do that is a very good definition of what is impact investment. And there's no global framework telling us what is a global investment, which is really making impact. We lack the metrics. We don't have the measurements yet in place, especially on healthy diets, for instance, or living incomes. And we also don't have policy enabling environments that recognize this link. And it's funny because to be honest, I'm very happy walking around, seeing so many food pavilions, a food security roundtable for the very, very first time last Monday in the World Leaders Negotiations. Let's celebrate that progress. But it's not enough. And why not? Not only because agriculture is part of the problem, but also climate change is part of the agriculture problem. Actually, we do see that it is already politicized. Climate change is worsening the food crisis. And you don't hear a lot of connections in the discussions talking about climate change because they are simply too separately taken and not connected to the food problem that can really get worse. Think about immigrants, think about competition for water or land use, worsened by climate change. Think about trade policies in place, global stocks that are being protected by countries because they simply have to feed their own population. There's not a lot of talk about that precise connection yet. So let me go back to finance then. We have to be able to look at it from a holistic approach, to really integrate and make sure that next COP28, we will discuss all these aspects. And then the finance sector can more easily, together with the blended finance partners, address all of this, to which I can come back to your second question on how Rabobank, for instance, can do this and already tries to do this. But I think it's very important to have a systemic approach and have an understanding at the climate stakeholders that a food system reversal is the only way forward. So I think if we can manage together to keep on insisting that there is this connection, it will be easier also for the finance partners to facilitate the agricultural producers, all through the value chain towards a better sustainability performance. Thank you, Federico.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. That was also a very, very important practical look at how banks are working on this. I hope now, given sometimes online connectivity issues, but we do have two very important speakers joining us, in fact, both of them from Italy. So it is my pleasure and honor to give the floor to Stefano Gatti, Ambassador Stefano Gatti, who is the Italian Special Envoy for Food Security, and partly behind some of the conversation we're having. And my question to Stefano Gatti is, what are Italy, the European Union, and the other global fora doing about this bridging between adaptation and food security? Is it true that because of the attention on food security in the current crisis, this can help driving adaptation agenda more towards food systems? Please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. I hope you hear me. Also, thank you very much for the invitation to this panel that we think is a very important one. Regarding also the title of the panel and bridging on the question you have posed, let me first of all say that obviously political attention to how food security issues and food system transformation impact climate change is key. So it's extremely important that this COP27 is now pushing higher on the agenda the role of food system transformation in addressing also the climate change challenges. This morning I was participating to a panel where Jeffrey Sachs was reminding everybody that between 20 to 30% of the emissions of carbon dioxide in the world come from the food chain. But on the other side, we have to continue to produce food, produce it well, produce it in a sustainable way, and make sure that more than half of the population of the world that does not have access to a healthy diet can have that. So the challenge is enormous. Let me say that Italy is involved both in the G7 and G20 process, is from the G20 material declaration that we have pushed forward and promoted during last year presidency of the G20, that if you look at paragraph 7 of the material declaration, we have that for the first time G20 countries recognize the urgency of supporting the adaptation of food systems, including fast-tracking the use of climate finance. So one of the challenges is finance. Speaking about food system transformation, obviously we all know, and this is the title of the panel today, that we need a lot of resources and a lot of money. One of the challenges here is, where does that money come from? And there is a lot of financing around. You see always big international institutions committing to money also for the food security crisis when crises are there. Most of this is on emergency, emergency action, emergency and humanitarian action that obviously is needed and due, but quite little of this money is addressed to what we think we need to concentrate on, that are key structural solutions to food insecurity. So the middle and long-term measures and projects that we have been discussing also some of the speakers before. So pushing financial institutions and Italy with other European Union partners and the European Commission, and also with the growing collaboration that we have with FAO, and it's very good to have also Maximo Torero here, wants to push the financial institutions to make sure that the amount of finances that is committed goes towards the middle and long-term structural interventions that are needed. This is sound investment policy. If you invest on medium and long-term projects, you will have less of emergency needed situation to intervene on. And this is very much at the core of our action and activity in all the multilateral global fora. So I hope I have answered to your question, but let me conclude saying that Italy has at the center of its food security policy, with the nomination of a special envoy on food security, that is myself, two important regions. One is Mediterranean, that obviously is Africa and the Africa region. And there, in both these regions, the issue of financing, blended financing, how we do the right and find the right solutions on financing is really one of the very important topics we are working on. Thank you very much.
Important point from the global community support to these processes. And now, last but absolutely not least, we're also very honored in effect to have maybe the host of this event, because Maximo Torero is the FAO chief economist. You may have seen him in other events, etc. He's a very important person in a very important organization. He has an overview of everything that has to do really with the SDGs and food. So, Maximo, thanks for being here. And my first question to you is, given what have you heard so far, what else can be done to bridge food and climate diplomacy, to promote better finance for the adaptation of food systems? And can this be done also while avoiding a debt trap for Africa? Because that's a bit always the issue when you borrow money. Thanks a lot, Maximo, for being here. You have the floor.
No, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Let me follow up on. I think one of the most important things that you raised at the beginning is to understand that if we want to achieve access to healthy diets for overall the 3.1 billion people don't have access to healthy diets, there will be trade-offs, and those trade-offs are related, of course, to more emissions, and we need to find which are the best pathways to minimize those, so that we can achieve a sustainable agri-food system. Because agriculture, as it has been said, plays a crucial role in creating and bringing emissions, especially methane emissions, but also is a huge sector where we can reduce emissions through adaptation and also through mitigation. So that linkage is very clear, and that's something that COP needs to understand, and is something that agriculture has to be a key player, because it's also the sector where the biggest gain can be obtained by reduction of emissions through adaptation. Now, to understand this, is also important to know that if we model how much is needed to be able to achieve the goal of increasing access to healthy diets, and what trade-offs that will create, we are talking of around 7 to 8% of the food market value that needs to be invested to mitigate climate change and to create the sustainability that is needed. And Africa's share is a significant share, is around 27% of the 7 to 8% of the global market value. So we need to work to find a solution for that. And clearly the public sector alone cannot do it. We need to bring the private sector to this. But if we want to bring the private sector, we must also understand that agriculture is an area, and the agri-food system is a sector that lives under huge risk and uncertainties. It's a sector that is completely vulnerable to climate extremes, to variability, to excess of water, to volatility, excessive volatility of temperatures, which makes more difficult decisions, and it also will be affected by how diseases will be moving across. So it's a sector that is under risk and uncertainty. So clearly it's not an ideal sector where you will get returns with not a discount because of risk and uncertainties. And that's where the blending component plays a crucial role. Because what the blending will do is to reduce this risk level so that we can attract private sector investment in this sector. Second, it's important to understand that although the biggest share of production is done by big producing countries, there is a significant role of smallholder farmers in most of the most vulnerable sites of the world, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and also in some parts of South America. So how we can do this in such a way that we create the scale and the volume to include them in this process of blending finance. So at FAO, we are looking very closely on how we can create that mechanism, because we need to recognize the value of the change of actions that the farming sector will have, the SME sector will have across the value chain. We are talking of around 1.2 billion people being touched directly by the food value chains, and around 4 billion people indirectly. It's a huge amount. It's close to half of the world population, which are indirectly touched by the agri-food system. So how we are going to compensate and how we are going to create this blending that is needed. One of the ways we are looking at this is through territorial approaches. And that's what we call our hand-in-hand initiative. Why? Because we basically identify in most of the regions in the world and in the countries that we are working, we have right now 54 countries working on hand in hand, where investments will make sense and how we can make those investments sustainable to boost agricultural production, so produce more with less in a sustainable way, and use a pathway that minimizes that level of emissions. And for that, we use tools to measure what will be the emission level that these activities will create. Now, why is helpful? Because these areas are territories that have a lot of smallholders and where most of the poor people are, but they have significant agricultural potential. So we're trying to tackle several objective functions at the same time. One is to reduce poverty by using agricultural activities, but taking into account the best pathways of investments that are needed to minimize the potential trade-offs. So this is through adaptation. Now, this allows us to create a mechanism where we can beat what will be the minimum de-risking that is needed, the minimum cost or subsidy for this de-risking through blending, so that we can attract private sector into the game. So we have to find those ways to be able to do that. Other international financial institutions are doing something similar at a bigger scope, like the IFC, for example, in the World Bank. So the point that I'm trying to make is that I think we need to find this type of solution so that we recognize the returns of those investments in terms of reduction of emissions, but at the same time providing what is needed to assure food security and access to healthy diets, and how we can use a level of subsidy that will attract the private sector. And given there is a lot of lack of knowledge of what is that minimum level of de-risking, trying to create a bidding mechanism, I think, will allow that to happen. That was done in the telecommunication sectors when we wanted to expand it to the rural areas, and it worked pretty well. So I think it's another mechanism that will allow us to bring this up. And it will allow us to avoid a debt trap, because essentially we don't want countries to get indebted. On the contrary, the repurposing of the investments have to be done in such a way that this minimum subsidy that is required to the risking will be coming through reallocation of what is already there, the resources that are there, but aligning to the correct incentives. So as a technical partner, our role is to try to find these type of solutions that will help us to assure that we will attract private sector investments, we understand that we are taking the best possible pathways, and we recognize the benefits to the agri-food systems, of sustainability of agri-food systems, of these type of investments, and how this de-risking mechanism will help to attract private sector and reduce the risk in the agricultural sector. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this, Maximo Torero. And now I need you, panelists, please, to answer another question, but really quick, 1-2 minutes, few sentences, so that we have a space for 2 questions from the panel. Stephen Muciri, what needs to happen at the level of in-country investment processes to bridge adaptation and food security? Because we've been talking about a lot of global, but in-country investment process, what needs to happen?
Yeah, I think we all agree that to create any impacts, that has to happen at the local level. And I think the challenge you have at the country level is that we have a lot of power imbalances. You know, it's government, it's huge private sector, it's farm organizations. I think for the longest time, the investments that have actually been done by our governments, finances that have actually been put in agriculture, we don't see a lot of impact because farmers are still largely exposed. That's why any kind of shocks, like we are having shocks right now, a lot of farmers are actually thrown off, and I mean, they're actually very vulnerable. And I know the Just Rural Transition policy process talks about farmer centralism. You know, how do we actually build programs that are farmer-centric? I think for as long as we don't listen to the farmers, as long as we don't tilt these power imbalances and ensure that everybody is talking to each other, we are all being viewed as equal partners, then the excitement, I mean, our government just signed deals here 2 days ago. When you look at those investments, a lot of money goes to waste. There's financing that is actually coming through commercial banks. But you realize that these commercial banks are still using their own approaches. They're still not changing the products. They're not still improving the programs. It still doesn't have any kind of impact. And that's why we'll have challenges in terms of management or better management of natural resources. We still have challenges of identification of the right agriculture enterprises to invest in. We still have challenges in terms of resource allocation. I mean, we have programs at the national level. We have the CADI process. We have the national climate change programs. You can still see there's a lot of misalignment of those. Yeah, we still need to look at how, I mean, if there are power balances, you know, co-creation of knowledge and learning. And there's so much that farmers can actually provide. And I think for me that's the biggest challenge. You know, how do we manage the power imbalances? How do you ensure that everybody who is brought on the table is actually being listened to as an equal partner, because everyone has something to provide. And for me, I think farmers are the most unlistened to people. And that's why, in as much as we talk about putting together finances, programs for climate change, for as long as we don't listen and invest in just that, you know, what are the farmers saying? How do you convert whatever they are saying into investable programs or bankable, or whatever you want to call them? As long as there's investment as what farmers actually want, then we'll still have this discussion, these talks in every COP, you know, as we proceed. So that has to change. And there has to be a deliberate change. I mean, it's not just about signing deals, but at the grassroots, those changes have to actually be seen. And I think farmers have the capacity to be able to evaluate and give oversight to some of these programs. I have not heard farmers talking about some of the programs we are talking about. I haven't had feedback from them. So I think that has to shift. And if it doesn't shift, then these discussions just continue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. Ayman, concretely speaking, how do you look at capacity building in this mix? Do we need to do something bold at the level of capacity building for blended finance, for example?
Actually, I like bold. I like very much bold. And I also happen to like very much being here at this pavilion because the Mohammed VI Foundation for Environmental Protection, where I work, has had an MOU with the FAO at the high level, with the DG of the FAO and Her Highness Princess Lala Hasna for several years at the high level. We're talking about partnerships at the high level, but also on the ground. We've been working therefore following that with school children to teach them about nutrition as well, and reconnect them with nature has been something important. Looking at capacity building, I was starting to feel a bit jealous of my brother here from Kenya, because I was feeling the connection between the two of you. I was right in the middle of this particular connection. So I'll share an example from Morocco, if I may do that. And some of the projects we have had in that regard that I think are of interest. First, we've been working when it comes to climate finance, right? Investable projects, bankable projects. I was being a bit of a tease about bankable projects because for three reasons. First, I knew both of you would be speaking right after me, so I wanted to be a bit provocative. Second, because I believe that when we talk about bankable project, we send a signal that it is about banks. And I find it's beyond banks. There are other stakeholders that are in a position to invest and contribute. And thirdly, because sometimes the conversation about bankable projects, I find narratively has been putting a bit of too much of a pressure as for some of the main victims of climate change in terms of, oh, you're not getting the funding you need. It's because you're not making your project bankable. And I think this is quite an unfortunate way to frame this. But going back to the example I wanted to share with you about the kind of work we've been doing this year, I don't want to be too long because I know you indicated to me I have 2 minutes. On climate finance, we've launched in December 2021 a series of workshops all across Morocco. We did a first national workshop. We're doing the 12th of them as I'm speaking in the 12th region of Morocco. We do another national workshop at the very end. And the way we've structured those workshops, and I think it is fairly bold, is that we worked with the local stakeholders and we worked with everyone at the local level. So we did climate finance training with gardeners at the local level, engineers at the local level, administrators at the local level, private sector. All these stakeholders, we gave them training about climate change in general, gave them examples of projects, what is sought. We gave them some concept notes with the Green Climate Fund, and we're like, okay, how would you do this? How would you not do that? Also at the national level for domestic resource mobilizations over several days. And at the end of the year, we're going to bring all the stakeholders together. We'll be looking at some of the projects they've identified, and we'll be working with them to go towards the next step. Now, it may not be as bold as it could be, but I think it is a step towards boldness, because at the end of the day, it's about concrete action and concrete implementation and concrete projects, as you were saying yourself. Thank you. I hope I wasn't too long.
Thanks so much, Eman. Catherine, now looking at the COP27, is it realistic that the COP27 adaptation finance negotiation and the delivery plan for the doubling of adaptation will take into account all of what you're saying and having much more resources going to agriculture and food systems?
I think the case was made quite clearly. So if I was saying no, I'm not sure it would make sense. No, I think it makes sense, and I think it makes sense not only because we all have a responsibility to ensure that everybody has a decent livelihood, that people get their food, but it also makes sense because, as we said, agriculture is also responsible for emissions. And so if we want to tackle climate change, we cannot ignore it. I mean, it's part of the equation, has to remain part of equation, and probably I would share your view, it needs to be a bit more prominent in the discussion because we tend to forget about it. And I think two elements are very important to ensure that it is part of the equation. Data, we need to make sure that we have the data. And as far as EIB is concerned, actually, when we look at adaptation, a very important element, apart from upstream engagement to ensure that we work on the strategies and we help countries do that, is about making sure that we get data on the project to see what is the climate risk of that project, and that applies, of course, to projects tackling in the agriculture sector, and that we can adapt the project so that it is more responsive, but that this rests on a set of very robust data, and science is important. The other important element is technology, because the changes and the adaptations will only happen if we have the adequate technologies. And there again, I mean, Kenya is a great example of how technology can be transformative also for agriculture. M-Pesa, I mean, I miss my M-Pesa in Europe tremendously, because this has changed people's life, especially in the agri-sector, and there are lots of examples of how it's helping. And then one other element, I just mentioned another concrete example, is when you tackle food, it's also a matter of tackling food waste or avoiding food waste. And there are also, we need to do cold chain. And there is also great examples of how you can help cold chain, because that will help farmers bring their products. The products will be kept cool, they will be transported. And de facto, we have a project where we do both food and vaccine, because the issue is still there, actually. But I think, yes, we need to bring this topic forward. And I think as far as EIB is concerned, I mean, it is really now being pushed as an agenda in what we do. Thank you. One more thing I'd like to tell you. Thank you for having a gender-balanced panel, because also a lot of farmers are women.
Indeed, it was not by chance that this is the panel. And Suzanne, very quickly, please. In all this mix of financing, are public guarantees important to be discussed in country-level investment processes? Are you encountering guarantees? Should they be done more to de-risk agriculture?
Well, I think that's a no-brainer. I think it's a rhetoric question, Federico. And why? Because actually we did take a bold approach in the bank 2 years ago when we established a new department only focused on smallholders. Smallholder farmers is a client entity in Rabobank that is a separate entity. And why? Because smallholder farmers can be part of that solution. They can be a huge enabler in climate mitigation. They also have a very good access to markets and finance if they are enabled in an ecosystem approach. And as my neighbor just mentioned, it's about data, it's about technology. And through this ecosystem approach, you can have digitized approaches in which you can unlock both the inputs that they need, the supplies that they need, but also collect the data that is very relevant in getting all these different approaches in getting access to finance and funding. We call this actually a patient capital approach. And what is needed now to really scale these type of solutions, and I can mention all of them, in which we are actually enabling millions of farmers at week. But I think it's important to focus on what is even more needed, and that is what I said. We need to know how to scale this, but we can only unlock grants from foundations if we know that we can focus on cold chains, on food and waste reduction, and if we know there's a recognition that that in itself is also mitigating climate change. And next week there will be, for the very first time ever, a food loss and waste reduction pledge launched at a COP to explicitly make that link between greenhouse gas emission reduction and food loss and waste reduction. And I think these are maybe baby steps on the one hand. On the other hand, they are very concrete and they help us to link that agenda that we talked about in the beginning of this conversation. Back to you, Federico. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Ambassador Gatti, given today's discussion, what else can be done from what you see at the global level to increase financing for the adaptation of food systems? In a short answer, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Francesco. First of all, let me say that I really agree with many of the points that the speakers have highlighted before. At a global level, there are many things happening. We should clearly be working on rechanneling the advanced economy's 100 billion special drawing rights to vulnerable countries. As I said before, we should make sure that different financing program and projects that are launched by international financing institutions do concentrate also and have a big share of this financing towards middle and long-term structural projects. Let me also mention that at COP27, the FAST initiative that sees also FAO part of it will be launched by FAO and the Egyptian presidency with the support also of the government of Italy. So there are many initiatives there, and it's important to work all together in collaboration to channel them in the right way. And for this, and I will conclude, I will second what our friend representative of the African farmers have said. We have to work at national level, and we have to hear, farmers. We have to hear the voice of farmers, what they need, what they want, and be sure that the projects are developed around those needs. Italy has very strong structured and organized farmers association with many millions of farmers members of them, and many of them are starting to work internationally and partnering with other farmers association, also in collaboration with FAO, and they recently launched the Food Coalition project in order to identify the common projects and work together between farmers associations, between countries. That is also something very important that we need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Maximo Torero, what else do you expect COP27 to deliver to put food systems more at the center of the climate finance agenda? In really 2 minutes, please.
No, quickly. Let me first say that we just launched on Monday the emission shares database for the agri-food system by country level, so you can find it in FAO-Stat. So there is an enormous amount of work that has been done to have this ready, so that we know exactly how much emissions are created across the agri-food system and by country. And also we have the exact tool which help us to measure that at the level of the project, which is what we do with many IFIs. Now, what can else be done? So first, the delivery plan is central, but it needs to be implemented. Climate finance has consistently fallen short of the US 100 billion per year targeted in 2009, and particularly so in adaptation, which has received less than a third of climate finance. So at the COP of Glasgow Climate Pact set the unprecedented goal for developed countries to double the funding provided to developing countries for adaptation by 2025 to around $40 billion per year. So this commitment must be kept and must be implemented so that we can move forward. Second, I think it's essential to use our resources in the most effective way and the most efficient way. And for that, it's essential that we start to look at the support in agriculture across countries and trying to see if they are aligned to the incentives that we're looking for, which is basically reduction of emissions and adaptation. So for that, we need to see where the incentives are not properly aligned and to create what we call the repurposing of subsidies towards the proper alignment. So there are two sources of funding that could help us to achieve the goal, but we need to implement them and we need to clearly take action. And what we are working together with the government of Italy is helping in that process to achieve that. But we need to scale this up so that we can achieve the goals we have in mind. And in that respect, and linked to the pledge of food loss and waste, which we are significantly part of that too, I think it's important to understand that in all our analysis of the trade-offs in climate, waste and food loss reduction is the one that creates the most positive trade-offs. So it's a huge opportunity which we can achieve in the short term, especially in the waste side, Because when we destroy food, we create enormous amount of methane emissions in addition to the emissions that were used to produce that food. All in this world where we have a significant number of hungry people, undernourished people, and a lot of people that don't have access to healthy diets. So it's essential that we target and prioritize actions to be able to achieve the goal. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maximo. Torero, 2 questions only. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. Who would like to ask a question to this very distinguished group of people? We have Madame and the gentleman here. Please, Madame. Can you explain who you are and a quick question? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Aisha. I'm from Chad. I'm a youth climate change activist. And I heard you were talking about the food security and adaptation for finance. The thing is, in Chad, many villages, they cut down trees to use wood for food, which creates climate change problem. But in order to change that, to use better resources, they need finance. So my question is, for example, they can use, last year at COP26, we were talking about using solar pans by using the sunlight to cook food. So that can be good for our environment. My question is, do you fund NGOs? Do you partner with them, or do you fund them in order to help those local villages or places to use more renewable resources instead of cutting down trees and using woods? Or do you just finance the big banks of the countries? And that's it. Thank you.
Madam, if you can pass on the...
Thank you. I am Krishna from Nepal. I am really delighted to listen from the eminent panelist and also minister. Yeah. Well, I have 2 questions, actually, question or queries, you know. I am not quite sure whether this will be applicable or not. Climate change impacts on agriculture, particularly shortage of food, and all these things largely political. How do we address those political issues? This is one of the major problems I see. I am not quite sure about Africa, but in Asia. Another major important issue which I thought would have been raised is in the climate change, basically we will be dealing in future with the geopolitical problems. Geopolitical problem related to water use, particularly transboundary movement of water, transboundary movement of pollutants, transboundary movement of pollinatory species. So how do we actually address those? I think this is very fundamentally very important. These resources will be scarce, particularly water resources, at the context of climate change. So these are my questions. Thank you.
So who from the panelists, we don't have time for the whole round, but we have a question crucially, how do you reach the NGOs, the youth groups who are actually a crucial part of the local communities to make adaptation happen? Maybe you would like that, Saim? And then who would like to answer to the politics and geopolitics question, which is also not an easy one? Think about it. In the meantime, Salim tries to answer the issue of reaching the ground, the youth.
Sure. My sister Aisha from Chad, thank you very much for your excellent questions. I think opportunities exist, and I'll give you one example that I'm quite familiar with because the foundation has done it in collaboration with Yongo, with UM6P and OCP Group. It's the African Youth Climate Hub Incubator. In that regard, we have received more than 200 projects on adaptation and mitigation from all across the continent that are young entrepreneurs such as yourself, adaptation and mitigation. And I don't want to spoil anything, but some of the projects we have received are talking about exactly the kind of issues that you have identified and the kind of concrete projects that are answering to these problems and that we could be in a position to therefore support through incubation. This is one example. There are many, many other examples. In addition, while of course it is important to respond to and echo the voices and actions of Africa from Africa, there are also opportunities from other regions in collaboration with African project holders, like, for example, you could be, and maybe you are. I don't know. I'd be very happy to discuss with you further. I know, for example, the EU is doing a lot in that regard. From Morocco, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a signing of a Morocco-EU Green Partnership, and I'm assuming that there could be other kind of partnerships just like that that could be pushing, again, the boundaries in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We need a volunteer, otherwise I will pick. How do we address the big issues of politics and geopolitics coming into these big decisions we are trying to promote? Steve and Suzanne. Unless Maximo also or Ambassador Gatti want to say, we will have... okay, no, you're not waving wildly to answer, so we will get Suzanne and Steve answer the important policy.
I can answer on the water thing. Yeah.
And then quickly also Maximo, thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the elephant in the room. Politics, unfortunately, is entangled with a lot of food security challenges, even in Africa. And that's what I was talking about, power imbalances. I don't know, we talk about it. We've said about it as farm organizations. We need to be part and parcel of decision-making processes. We ask on some of the financial partners to have conditions, with respect to how finances are actually deployed, that, farm organizations or other bodies are actually part and parcel of those decisions. We've talked about being empowered to be able to, provide oversight and be part of evaluation and give feedback. But you know what happens? Politics always takes over, and unfortunately, that's what we have to deal with. But the struggle continues. I think we'll still continue pushing. We still push for partnerships with other civil society associations. We still push our governments to listen to us. Hopefully one day they will listen to us. I think what we actually need to do is that we need to continue putting together evidence of work that we actually do that has sustainable impacts on economics, on the social being of farmers, and how far and so we actually present this to governments, because we can't just keep quiet. We have to continue pushing for it. So I don't know any other way to respond to that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. Suzanne, and then Maximo.
Yeah, these are indeed excellent questions, and they reflect also a very nice discussion I had in the plane yesterday on my way to Charm, because I was next to a climate activist, and he was so angry, so angry. He said, why is business talking about opportunities? We should talk about risk, because the urgency is still there. And then we came to a nice compromise at the end of our flight. So we decided to talk about solutions. But those solutions can only be addressed if we do it together. And for instance, the NGOs in the Rabobank propositions that we have and the solutions that we come up with in these digitized ecosystem approaches is simply by not only working with MasterCard to unlock data and provide the farmers with smartphones, or with Microsoft to unlock GPS data on carbon sequestration, but also with the NGOs to get to these farmers. They have the networks of small-scale farmers, and more importantly, they know what they need. So we are very humble in really trying to have multi-stakeholder approaches and coalitions, and we need each other. But let's talk about solutions from now on in which we are all engaged in order to bridge that gap that is still way too sharp if you look at how things are being addressed in separate discussions. So thanks, Federico, for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne. Maximo, one last point, and then we need to give the floor to the rest.
Very quickly. So, if we look at the drivers of food insecurity, conflict is the biggest driver, and that applies to all countries in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. So that's something that we need to tackle. But of course, the best way to tackle these things is to increase welfare of households and to increase how we can make them more resilient to this type of shocks. That's the job that we have to do. We have to increase resilience. But at the same time, as it was mentioned before by our colleague from Africa, asymmetries of information are huge. And the only way we can help moving forward is to come up with the most possible information we have, so that we can make governments understand that no matter the politics they are playing, there are consequences to their actions, and therefore they need to realize them. And then you will see how the dynamics could start to change. For example, the repurposing of subsidies and support to agriculture initiative is bringing a lot of new information that is putting many countries uncomfortable. But that's something that we need to do, because that's the only way we will show that what they are doing is creating the wrong incentives, not only for their countries, but for the world. And the same is happening when we are going to finish measuring in the next 2 years the real cost of food, because we need to understand the externalities which are related, for example, to water issues. We need to understand those so that we can align and put proper incentives in place.
Well, thanks a lot. I can only close by saying that we were delighted to have this fantastic panel. Thanks for your contribution. There's never enough time. However, I also want to specify that this is not an ad hoc event. The Italy, FAO, ECDPM partnership and project that starts today is just at the beginning. We are launching, hopefully, a process where the people in the room will continue working together to some of the multi-stakeholder solutions we have announced. Just before getting out of the room, if you want to pick the publication about some lessons learned from Africa on blended finance for sustainable food system, this is for you. Keep in touch, and maybe we finish with a round of applause for our panelists. And have a good COP.